Hello everyone, and welcome to our first edition of the Ludus Rig, our PC building tutorial. I'm Seth, and I'm joined by Calvin. Hello, Calvin.
Hello, Seth. Hello, everybody.
And on this series, we are going to be utilizing the website PC Part Picker to show you guys how to build a computer.
Yes, this is a wonderful website. I wish that I had known about this earlier so that I could make more educated computer buying decisions rather than what I'm stuck with right now. Basically, I have well, let me give you a little bit of background here. My computer is a couple years old, and I basically just bought it on Amazon. It seemed like a decent price, and it seemed like, it was okay for like a low-end PC. I'd be able to, I wasn't at the time looking to run anything, spectacularly well on it, but it got the job done. But now, a couple of years go on, and I'm getting more and more games in my Steam library and things like that, and I'm doing more things with the computer that necessitate me getting a new machine.
Right,
And
and
that's where you come in, Seth.
correct, yes. And I also have been looking to get a new computer. Mine is about 5 years old now. But I paid, I don't know, like close to 2 grand for it when I got it. So it's been serving me well for these 5 years, but it is definitely time for an upgrade. And so because I was looking for upgrades and Calvin was too, and Calvin, let's say, didn't have quite as much knowledge about this stuff as I did, I thought, hey, what if we do a video series where I teach Calvin and in the process everyone else how to choose good parts?
Sure, yeah, because I've never actually built my own PC. I've always just kind of, the first couple computers I had for myself were just bought for me by my parents because they were the ones paying for them. So we just
Right.
go over to Best Buy or whatever. And then, the next few ones that I had after that, just kind of, I wasn't really making educated decisions. I did buy an all-in-one PC one time, and that was a very poor decision on my part.
Yeah.
uh, I would not recommend that to anyone. But here I am now. I'm ready to learn, and I've sort of gone over just sort of in my head the benefits of building your own PC, uh, and well, why don't we talk a little bit about that? Like, why are we even doing this? Why don't I just go to a computer store and buy a computer?
That's a good question. And I think there are two key reasons. First off, at a store, you are paying for the labor. So no matter what store you go to, it's going to be more expensive than if you build it yourself because you're not paying anyone to actually do the physical building.
Right.
So from a cost perspective, you're probably saving, a couple $100 at
Hmm.
the least, and significantly more than that if you're buying from one of these high-end dealers. So you've got the
Right.
price advantage. The other advantage is that in building your own, you are choosing every single part that goes inside that computer and choosing the part that you want.
Right, and then there's also the aspect of, if you go to, say, a Best Buy, then you're going to be in a high pressure situation where they're going to use a bunch of psychological tricks to get you to spend more money because they probably earn a commission on it.
Right.
So that's a bit of an uncomfortable situation for me. I personally, after having worked in sales for several years, I know what it's like, and I feel bad telling salespeople no.
Right.
So I'd like to avoid that kind of a situation. But even at a store like Micro Center, say for example, where they probably understand more that, you know, you're there because you want to buy a good PC, not because you just want a simple experience. I still just kind of it just makes me a little bit uneasy when I walk into a store, because I feel kind of vulnerable because then the salespeople sort of, you know, try to, interfere and crowd
Correct.
you.
Correct.
Sort of.
Correct. I don't know if you know this, Calvin. Micro Center's only a Southern and Midwest store, so for people who aren't familiar with
Oh,
Micro
I see.
Center, Imagine a high-end Best Buy. It is more focused on the computer aspect, and
Hmm.
the people. I haven't actually been to one in years, but last time I went, they all wore suits even, and it was all a very. It's a very nice
Oh wow.
um, high-end Best Buy experience. Was how it was at least 15 years ago when I last went to one.
Right. Or it's sort of like CompUSA, but CompUSA doesn't exist
Right,
anymore. But
right.
it's one of those types of things. Like they don't do. I don't think they do appliances or
No,
anything.
no, it,
Yeah.
it is a PC focused electronics
Electronic
store,
store. Yeah.
and at least at the time I went, it was billed as the high end,
Yeah.
the God, what would be the Cadillac
Oh right.
of PC purchasing options. So
Okay.
I don't know if it's still like that. It may have they may have tried to compete price wise with Best Buy, and it maybe isn't as nice anymore. But
Hmm.
when
So
I
then, I think maybe a more current comparison might be a Fry's, possibly.
sure,
Uh,
although Fry's is only West Coast, so
well, I've seen them in the Chicago
yeah,
area.
they are
Yeah.
moving east, but yeah, I think Best Buy these days is literally the only national chain of that sort that exists.
Oh, okay.
So there's
Wow.
actually no place you can say other than Best Buy that every single viewer is going to be familiar with.
Well, I'm giving them options,
Yeah, but
just like
yes,
what we're doing
Micro
here with
Center
us.
is well, Fry. The difference with Fry's is Fry's is huge. It's
Yeah.
a mega computer store. It's bigger than even a Best Buy. But anyway, all this
Yeah.
is completely off topic. Point is, regardless of where you go, you're going to be paying more. You're going to have to be dealing with pushy salespeople,
Mhm.
and you're not going to be certain about the exact nature of every single component in the machine.
Mhm.
And at a Best Buy or a Fry's or a Micro Center, regardless of where you are, they are going to try to cut corners because their job is to earn money off each of these sales.
Mhm.
And so there are going to be components that they are going to not tell you about because they're not something you're going to ask about, like, say, the motherboard.
Mhm.
And they're not going to buy a $200 motherboard like you would see on your screen right now, the motherboard. Hopefully you guys can see this with my mouth. I have a $200 motherboard here. This is
Mhm.
on a $1,900 computer. So that goes all the way down. Here's the lowest end build we've put together in advance. We're going to be putting together one of these builds as we go. But on the lowest end one we built in advance, this is a $60 one, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
there are huge differences between the prices of motherboards, even when you're talking about the same series of motherboard. These are all, every single motherboard in any of these builds is an LGA 1151. We'll talk
Mhm.
about that more later, but point is, when you go into Best Buy, no one's going to tell you which motherboard from this series is in this computer.
Right. Yeah,
And,
because that's not something that the average computer consumer is really concerned about. All
right,
they want to know are, does it have higher numbers?
right. And
Uh,
there are no numbers here. You'll
yeah,
notice,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
none of this means anything to you, most likely.
Hmm.
And the fact is, though, that there's a huge difference between this $56 one and that $200 one.
Hmm.
And, deciding for yourself whether or not you want to get that $200 one is the type of thing you get to do when you build your own that you don't get to do when Best Buy chooses the parts for you.
Right. Or, when HP or
Right,
Dell
correct,
or
correct.
whoever. Yeah.
When any company chooses those parts for you, they are only going to choose the more expensive parts when those parts are the parts that consumers are going to be looking at.
Hmm.
And so you're going to lose out in a lot of ways and end up still paying more regardless. So that's why you would
Hmm.
build your own.
Right.
The
Excellent.
Yeah, and I think the other thing worth mentioning that I think is different in this series than in a lot of other series you're going to find on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet about building PCs is, while we are going to offer a couple suggestions about what different parts you could get at different price levels, the goal here is to educate everyone on how to choose the correct part for their own needs.
Right.
It's I am not going to just list a bunch of parts that you should buy and where you to buy them. That's that's helpful for the next 2 weeks until the next set of parts come out, at which point this video then becomes obsolete.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah,
As I mentioned to you when I first pitched this, well, you're the one who pitched the idea for the video, but I first came to Seth asking for help on how to build a PC, and I was asking not just specifically what parts I should get, but I asked him how do I know what parts to choose because if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, et cetera, et cetera.
right, correct, exactly, and that's true for computers maybe more than anything else just because the pace of new releases is so high and the difference
Hmm.
between one release and another can be so large. So my goal here is that by the end of this, Calvin and by extension everyone else watching this should be able to know enough about each of these components to choose whatever the best one is in their price range at whatever time they need to choose one.
Yes.
And obviously, at some point, the computer technology will change so much that this video will be obsolete regardless. But hopefully, instead of that being 2 weeks, that will be 2 decades from now.
Right. Right. Yeah, because, you know, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have even, well, maybe some people would have been concerned about the GPU.
No, they
Uh,
wouldn't have because GPUs didn't exist then.
okay, yeah, see, that's exactly what I'm
You know,
saying. Yeah,
that's the type of thing. Here's something to think about. 20 years ago, if GPUs had just started to come into existence, but there were 30 different makes, there was no standardization. You also
hmm
had sound cards that you would
yeah,
have had to put in your computer that we're not going to be including here.
hmm
And there are tons of things that there are completely new components that are added or removed. You'll notice that none of the builds I've built here have an optical drive
hmm
because barely anything comes on a disk anymore. So why am I wasting money putting an optical drive in here?
Well, maybe you want to build a legacy system because you have all of these old
Yeah,
disks
sure.
that,
And
yeah.
if you want an optical drive, that's another thing that as you build, because we're building our own, if Calvin says to me, "Hey, I think I have enough disks that an optical drive will be worth the money," then I put an optical drive in, right?
hmm hmm
Whereas
hmm
Best Buy, I don't have an option. I have if it has one, it has one. If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Right.
So, that's the other thing. There are complete components that I've left out of some of these builds because I don't think they're necessary for what we're trying to do.
Great. Well, there you go. Okay, I hope that's convinced everyone that building your own PC is definitely the way to go,
Right.
I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I also wanted to mention is that while almost all of the parts, when you are building a new computer from scratch, you're going to want to trash everything from your own computer and literally start from scratch. There are a couple components, and when we get to them, I'll mention them in specific, that you might be able to recycle from an old computer and
hmm
attach into this
hmm hmm
and save some money that way.
Well, and let's also think about maybe the prospect of some of the parts that we put in now can help us down the line, or
Correct.
that we may want to skimp on something right now with the intention of upgrading it later.
Correct,
That kind of thing.
exactly, yes. And that is how I always build computers, with the thought of which parts do I need to last the longest and which parts can I replace.
Right.
And I'm going to say before, because I actually think that's an incredibly important thing to mention when building a computer, is future-proofing it and understanding that some components are very easy to replace over time, others are not. And so I want to bring everyone's focus to this CPU and motherboard here. This is the first thing we're going to talk about.
hmm
And these two things need to be your most future-proof components.
hmm
Everything on your computer attaches to the motherboard. Every CPU only can attach to a single one of these models of motherboard. So the most important thing that you can do is choose the latest generation of CPU and motherboard in your computer, even if you have to get a slightly slower CPU of the newest generation, because getting the latest motherboard means that you have another couple years to upgrade everything else.
hmm
And it's also important to mention that in this day and age, CPUs are not advancing nearly as quickly as they were even 10 years ago. And the difference between a CPU of um, one generation and the next is not especially large, nor is the difference between one or two steps within the line of each series. And so the most important differences are going to be the advances on the motherboard.
Okay.
So, yeah, I cannot stress enough that even if you skimp on every other part, every other thing listed here can be replaced.
Right.
When the CPU and motherboard go, you have to start over from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
So
Because the new motherboard might not be compatible with all of
the new
the
motherboard,
other
I
parts.
guarantee you, within a year, the new motherboards will not be compatible with any of the things listed here. Maybe the video card. Video card
Yeah.
sometimes can go, but the memory. I'll talk a lot about this when we get to memory, but the main difference between this generation of CPUs and the previous generation, these support this type of memory.
Mm-hmm.
We could have saved probably $20, $30 if we had gotten the one that said i3 5300.
Mm-hmm.
This one is not even much faster. It will give him 5% more speed or something.
Yeah.
But he now has support for a memory format that is going to be used for a decade,
Mm-hmm.
instead of the tail end of a legacy memory format that is no longer in use at all. So
Good point. Good point.
that's the type of thing that you want to look at when building a computer. You want to say, which one of these things are things that are going to be important going forward,
Mm-hmm.
and try to tailor it to that.
Let me see if I understand this correctly. So,
Okay.
when it comes to just a general overview of building your own PC, the two main components to think about are the motherboard and the CPU, because, and those are things that you don't necessarily want to skimp out on,
Right.
because those are going to be future-proofed, as you said. They're
Correct.
going to be compatible with whatever parts we might want to replace in the future.
Correct.
So if I cheap out on the CPU because I don't know if I want to pay that much for it, then I'm actually kind of shooting myself in the foot for the future, because then I won't, maybe I do want to upgrade the RAM or the GPU, or even like you pointed out, even the hard drive, right?
Right.
It might not necessarily be compatible.
Correct. I think that's almost entirely accurate. One thing I will add on to that is the important thing here is getting the latest generation. It's
Mhm.
not this Core i3 part, it's this 6300 part, not the 300 part, but the 6 part.
Okay.
That 6 is telling you what generation of Core i3 it is. 6 is the latest
Okay.
generation. That is the important thing to focus on here, is making sure you get the latest generation part. The difference between, and we can actually switch to the high-end build for a second to examine this.
Mhm.
Here you see a Core i5 6400, right? It's, what is that, $40 more, $50 more
Mhm.
than the other model. Okay? So, for $50, you're getting a quad-core processor over a dual-core processor, and we'll discuss that in a bit. But I think, in most cases, it's less important that he get a more powerful processor than he get the very latest end model. And obviously there are limitations to that. At some point you're going to get so low that it's, just not going to work. But
Mhm.
in a lot of cases, it's better to spend $20, $30 on getting the latest generation than it is on getting the next step up in a previous generation.
Right, because that extra 0.2 gigahertz processing power is going to be a marginal increase.
Correct.
For the cost, versus just making sure that the latest line is what you're looking for.
Right, correct.
And again, like you may want to you may not want to spend all that much, but there are certain things,
Correct.
just like in all other areas in life, where you get what you pay for.
Right.
And if there are certain things, like you would not want to necessarily buy the cheapest car
Right.
you could find, or the cheapest washing machine you could find, because you want to make sure that it's going to last you for a while, so that you don't have to replace it the next year.
Correct. It's also worth mentioning that even so, again, we're talking about the 6,000 line here. Here's the highest end version we have built. This is still a 6,000 line. This one's $308. So
Hmm.
there is still, there's a doubling of price between a low end of that line and a high end of that line. So you can still get a relatively cheap part while
Hmm.
still getting the latest generation of processor. So, just so people can follow along, here's what each of these words in this mean. Intel's the brand, it is the make. Okay,
Hmm.
every Intel processor starts with Intel. Core i3 refers to the spot on the individual generation of processors that this processor is located. And so Intel breaks its processors down into three separate divisions, i3, i5, and i7. You following that?
Yes.
So an i3 would be your low end of an individual series of processor, an i5 would be your mainstream, and i7 would be your high end.
Hmm.
So multiple different processors of different generations and even of the same generation will have an i3, i5, or i7 designation. That is merely saying i3, this is low end, i5, this is mainstream, i7, this is high end. That's all that
Hmm.
means. That is not the model, that is not the generation. There's so much misconception about what that means. That's all that means. It is merely telling you high end, medium end, low end.
Hmm.
So that's an important distinction to make and to understand when choosing parts is there were Core i3s 10 years ago. You don't want to buy them, but just because it is a Core i does not make it a new processor, does not make it a good or a bad processor. It is merely telling you which market that processor is targeted at.
It's kind of like you could buy yourself a Chevy Malibu now. You
Correct.
could buy yourself a Chevy Malibu from 15 years ago,
Correct.
and they're going to be two completely different qualities.
Yes, exactly. So that's an important thing to understand. I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions about processors is that every Core i3, i5, i7, the only difference is the speed. That's not true at all.
Hmm.
It's absolutely not true. There are massive, staggering differences within.
Well, and this is the problem with Best Buy because you go into shop for a computer and that salesperson is going to tell you, oh yeah, this one's got a Core i5 processor that's 3.8 gigahertz. Well, okay, that's all well and good, but
Right.
you
But
know,
it no, the important thing, and so then we get back to this. As we said, this number after tells you the exact model. The first number, it's going to be either the very first generation had no number here, so
hmm
those will just be a number in the hundreds.
hmm
Starting with the second generation, it's a 2000. Third generation, 3000, and so forth.
hmm
So the most important number you're going to look at is this first number that comes after the i3. The 6000 tells you it's the current generation, and we're recording this for people who watch this in the future in, what are we, August of
August.
2016. So, as of August 2016, the 6000 line is the newest line.
Hmm.
Um, assuming they keep using the system, all you have to do is look at the number here, and you'll know for whatever time it is you're watching this what process you're getting, unless of course they moved on from the entire naming convention, in which case you'll have to look it up. But for the foreseeable future, the next series will probably have a 7000, and the one after that an 8000, and so on. So
Hmm.
that's what that first number means. The next three numbers are simply telling you which exact model in that line. And they just go up, starting 6100 would be the lowest, and I believe 6900 is the highest.
Great.
Uh,
Simple enough.
Yep, that's simple enough. There's a slight alteration in that the K models are
Hmm.
designate the very high end ones. They're they're the extreme edition.
Hmm.
So that's your only slight wrinkle in that. That if it has a K at the end, it is a better version of whatever number that is.
All right. Good to know.
So that's how you read the naming conventions. The number before gigahertz here, that's GHz, that
Hmm.
number is telling you the speed of each individual core. Dual core, that's telling you how many cores. We'll talk about that in detail later.
Mm-hmm.
Your options are going to be generally these days dual core, quad core, and possibly there are some that are hecta-core, which is 6.
6, yeah.
And AMD even makes an octa-core processor. But
Oh, wow.
um, we'll go into more of that detail, what that means later. But just so you know, when they're talking about the number, this here they're referring to the number of cores. Obviously, the word processor is what it is. It's a processor.
All right.
So that's how you read this. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just trying to make all of these words clear and understandable to everyone. Think of the CPU as the brain of your computer, and that's how you read what type of brain it has.
Great. No, I think that was very helpful.
So, I wanted to start with the very basic description of what is a computer, how does it work, like, what exactly are you buying?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think when you're choosing a component, understanding the actual physical nature of these things helps both when I try to describe what it's doing and when you're trying to choose the best part. If you actually understand what all this means, I think that's, a big advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to try to do this in pretty layman's terms. I don't have I'm not a physicist, so, I'm not necessarily the person to describe it in complex technical terms regardless. So let me try to do this, and, Calvin, stop me if this is not making sense.
Okay.
And I'll try to explain it a different way. So at its core, all a computer is a bunch of switches. And all a computer does is switch those switches from their on position, which is 1, to their off position, labeled 0. Every single program, every single function of a computer is determined by which switches are in the on position and which switches are in the off position.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
To perform a calculation, all a computer does is swap the switches between on and off, and each combination equals a different number, and that's how you get your mathematical functionality.
Right.
And from that very basic ability comes literally everything a computer does. In the old days, in World War II, when the first computers were being built, these switches were physical switches.
Right.
A physical on-off switch that would be flipped by a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually would be flipped automatically, but they were still physical switches. These days, the microprocessor, the CPU, those switches are no longer physical things. They're actually little tiny electrical currents. And and when you run the current, there's an atom. And if the atom is on the left side of this electrical current, then it's a 0. If it's on the right side, it's a 1. When you switch the polarity of the current, it switches from one side to the other, the atom. And making a computer more powerful is merely the act of putting more switches in the same amount of space by making each individual switch smaller.
Well, because basically we're just kind of moving electrons from one place to the other.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
You're just moving one thing into one of two spots, and if you have enough different possible combinations, you can pretty much make any system you want. The only other way you make it more powerful is by making those switches occur more quickly. That's your speed. That's your 3.8 gigahertz, as you can see on your screen. That's telling you how quickly it switches from one spot to the other. There is a pretty definite physical limitation at which point you can no longer make it any faster. And so that is why you're seeing speeds between 1 and 4 gigahertz today, just like you were 10, 15, 20 years ago, because there's a limitation at which point you simply can't make it go any faster.
Right, simply because the laws of physics don't permit for it.
Right, correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it would be like, here, let's break this down. Imagine that you were on one of those old computers, the original computers, and you were the person who had to physically switch each one of those switches,
Correct.
you could increase your speed. You may be able to get to a faster point to be able to switch them faster, but at some point your physical body is only capable of moving at a certain speed.
Correct.
And then you can add more people into that, and you can,
Right.
that's where I think dual core, that kind of comes into it.
Correct. That is exactly
Yeah.
where that comes into it.
Hmm. But even so, you're only limited by the physical capabilities of how fast you can actually move to switch these switches.
Correct. And we'll come back to that analogy in a bit because
Hmm.
it will help explain a couple things about the nature of dual cores. But that's a very good analogy, and that's exactly what it is. There is a point in which you just simply can't switch the current any faster.
Hmm.
Or so the issue is not actually you can't switch it at pretty much infinite speeds. It's just a matter of the faster you're doing that, the hotter it gets, and at some point the whole system melts.
Right.
So they've actually in labs where they have dropped down to absolute zero on the Kelvin scale, negative 100 degrees Celsius.
Hmm.
They've gotten up to 100 gigahertz.
Wow.
If in a point where there is no heat,
Yeah.
then you can do that.
I
But
want one of those.
yeah, in a room that is between, say, 60 and 80 degrees, where most computers are located.
Fahrenheit.
Yes, Fahrenheit, correct.
Hmm.
Yes, 30 and 40 degrees Celsius are around there. There's a limitation at which point going any faster is just going to literally melt the machine.
Right.
And no amount of fans and cooling options are going to resolve that at some point.
Hmm.
So that's where your speed limitation comes in, and that is why processors have gone from trying to get faster to putting more and more switches on them.
Hmm. Okay.
And so the last piece to talk about that is, well, they keep making it smaller and smaller, so surely they'll hit a point where they can't make it any smaller, and that is also true, and that is at the point where they're at.
Right.
Where each one of these bridges, as they're referred to, where or they're gates, I believe the technical term is gates. So
Yeah.
each one of these little gates that the electrons are switching from one side to the other of are right now 13 nanometers big.
Hmm.
A nanometer being the equivalent of 100 atoms. So
Hmm.
there are only 1,400 atoms between one side and the other right now. If you get any smaller, in fact, even at this point, if they actually developed a special material to allow them to get it this small. Once you get past about 2,000 atoms, then the electrons will actually jump from atom to atom.
Mm.
Because the atoms are so close together, the electron will not know which atom it is supposed to be rotating around.
Uh-huh.
And so that will cause what is referred to as quantum entanglement, and that causes terrible things to happen to the laws of physics, and it's really bad. It's really bad. That just basically causes the entire physical structure of an entity to disintegrate. So,
right. At that point, your computer melting is the least of your worries.
Yes. That's the type of thing you start worrying if the entire world is going to be sucked into a black hole. So, it's very bad if you get to the quantum entanglement issues, and about 10 years ago they hit 20 nanometer sizes, and they've been stuck on that until this year, which, as I said, they have worked for years on coming up with a incredibly thin chemical that they can attach to that gate to make it so the electrons stay on one side or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to develop that. And so that is what allowed them to finally jump down to 14 nanometers where they are now. And they overcame that, but we're at 14 nanometers. The next step for Intel is 10 nanometers. After that, it is unknown if they will ever be able to go smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So we're right at the very limit Obviously,
Okay.
your smallest point at about 1 nanometer, you can't get any smaller. There's no smaller entity to make.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's still a bit of ways before we get there, but 10 nanometers about hits the point where even this chemical will not resolve the problem. So we
Yeah.
are very, very, very close to hitting the limits of what a computer can do using silicon microprocessor technology.
So what that means then, basically, for a computer purchaser, for someone looking to buy a computer, is that the latest line is still going to be good for the foreseeable future.
Correct. That is absolutely true. The 2000 line, the second generation of iProcessors, is still used by, I believe, to this day, a majority of gamers, according to Steam's hardware surveys.
Okay.
And so, you think about that, there's been 4 generations since then, and
Mm-hmm.
the 2000 line is still working just fine.
Right.
So, you're talking very minimal increases over a very long period of time as far as CPU technology is generally concerned.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, all right. Well, let's talk about then how that fits into the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle here.
Okay, so how about I give a broad overview of the components we haven't talked about yet?
Sure. Yeah. Excellent.
Okay, so we know what a CPU is now, correct? It's the brain,
Yes.
it's the center of your computer. Think
Yes.
of the motherboard as sort of the torso of your body. It is where you're going to be connecting everything else to your brain.
Okay.
The motherboard does nothing in and of itself. It is just the thing that everything is connected to.
It's an interface between all of the physical
Correct.
devices.
Correct. There are, these days, AMD actually makes what's called an APU, which includes the motherboard, the CPU, the memory, and the video card all in a single chip.
Oh my.
Um, that's for laptop purposes.
Right. Yeah.
And it's also the same technology used in smartphones. So,
Okay. Yeah.
uh, for desktops, though, you still have a discrete motherboard that allows each component to be more powerful. The downside of using a discrete motherboard is that the information then has to travel from whatever component that information is currently in through the motherboard to the next component. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
on an APU, everything's all together in one single system, and so those travel times don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's a large part of the reason why there are certain games you'll find that seem to not to stutter a lot on PCs and don't on consoles.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is that consoles use APUs this generation. And
Okay.
so, like, if you recall the whole debacle over Batman Arkham Knight,
Right. Yeah.
and if you wondered why
Well,
aren't the
let's
consoles?
can we briefly just touch on that just to give some context?
Oh yeah, what the debacle was?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. On PC, Batman Arkham Knight had issues where the game would stutter constantly as it tried to load in new areas of the open world.
Yeah.
Whereas on consoles, that was not an issue at all, and people couldn't understand why PCs, regardless of how powerful they were having issues with this. The reason is that every PC still uses that motherboard, discrete motherboard, and so there was that half fraction of a millisecond where the data had to go from the memory to the CPU,
Mm-hmm.
and from the CPU to the GPU, and then back to the memory. And that whole process, even though it only takes a quarter of a second, there were enough big objects there that it was not doing it quickly enough.
Right.
And so one of the things I'm going to talk about as we build this is the ways that I've included specific components in, not as much in this, but when we talk about the high-end version that I have listed, we'll talk about how I included specific components to try to minimize that as much as humanly possible.
Okay. Good.
So
That's basically the motherboard then. It's I don't really know what else there is to say about that.
right.
It's
The
just kind of-
motherboard is an interface,
Yeah.
and we'll talk a little bit about some of the different things about it when we go into more detail about it. But yeah, the motherboard is the way you connect all the other pieces together. your memory is where you store the data that is currently being used by the system. Think of it as your short-term memory in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
Is what you're currently focusing on, what the PC is currently focusing on. The motherboard will have slots for a certain amount of memory. I
Or
believe
think of it as, to give another analogy, let's say you have a shipping business, right? Someone orders something. You're storing all of your material in a warehouse, okay? Someone orders something that needs to be delivered that day, so you load that material onto your delivery van. That delivery van is the memory because it's what's currently being operated on.
Correct.
Okay.
And so what I was going to mention is a motherboard might have 4 slots for memory or 2 slots depending. I think this motherboard that we've chosen for this build, being a lower end one, has just 2 slots.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what slot you put the memory in. You can put it in any of the slots. They're all identical. As long as you put the only thing to note is that you have to put the same memory in every single slot.
Mm-hmm.
But that's your only issue. As long as it is the exact same memory, it doesn't matter which slots you put them in. You can't mess it up. It's impossible. The same thing for the hard drive. There are going to be 3 or 4 hard drive bays. You put in any of the hard drive bays.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to worry about the stuttering issues I was talking about, you want to put it in the hard drive bay closest to the motherboard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're talking about millisecond delays here, so try to put everything as close together as possible. And, the less distance it has to travel, the less of a delay.
Well, right, because you're talking about just like the length of the physical cable connecting the hard drive to the motherboard, right? Because you're talking about electrons, which can theoretically move very, very close to the speed of light.
Correct.
But the speed of light is still a limitation.
Correct. Yes, we're talking about things so fast that they're beyond our ability to comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
But we are moving so much data in games these days so quickly that this tiny fraction of a second is a limitation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the simple act of moving a hard drive closer to the actual motherboard might fix the problem. So after your memory, you have your storage. And a hard drive is your long-term memory. In Calvin's analogy, if you had all of your product in a warehouse, that would be the warehouse.
Right.
So to utilize anything on the hard drive, it first has to be moved into the memory before it can be used by the CPU or the video card.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get more into detail about this later, but the 2 important factors of storage is 1, how much storage space you have, and 2, how quickly you can get it from the storage space to the memory.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we'll be focusing on. And here we have a 1 terabyte one listed, for example, that goes at 7,200 RPM.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk about what all that means in a bit.
Okay.
So that's storage. Then we get to the video card. The video card doesn't have a very good analogy in real life because it's a dedicated thing. The video card's purpose is to process video applications. That includes video games or movies or photo and video editing software, that type of stuff. That's done by the video card. I'm sorry, there's no good analogy to make with that, but basically, if you want something that has graphics, visuals, you need a video card.
Basically anything that you see.
Right.
Yeah.
So low-end video stuff can be done on the CPU through the software.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily need a video card to display video on your system. It's when you hit a certain level of fidelity that you're going to need a video card.
Right, because, in fact, every motherboard should have some kind of dedicated video output, whether it's VGA or DVI output.
AMD includes a integrated graphics card of its Radeon line on all of its motherboards. Intel has their own integrated line. Neither of those are very powerful, but it's worth mentioning that there are very basic integrated features on standard CPUs to allow for video playback.
Okay.
And they'll also play some low-end games.
Hmm.
But as soon as you get to the point where you want to play something that you would play on a console, then you're going to need a video card.
Right.
So video card is going to be its whole own video. We'll go into a lot of detail about all the different parts of it. So we're not going to talk too much about it here. But
Hmm.
the video card is for video game playing is going to be the most important component in regards to the performance of that game.
Hmm.
So you'll notice it's the second most expensive part listed here. There's a reason for that. It's important. Unlike the processor and the motherboard, you can swap out an old video card for a new one, or you can even put a second video card in and run them in parallel.
Hmm.
So there are options for upgrading your video card if, and this is not directed directly at you, Calvin, but anyone watching, if you need to save some money now, better to save it on the video card because that's something you can replace individually than skimping out on the CPU and motherboard where you're going to need to replace everything if you need to replace those. So, that is something I would also try to get people to understand is, yes, the video card is going to have more effect on the performance of your games today. But even though that is true, you should still focus on your CPU more.
Hmm.
The video card can be replaced, CPU cannot. Once you replace the CPU, the whole thing has to go.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Okay, then we got the case. The case is, that's self-explanatory. It's where you put all this stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but I mean, I don't think it's actually quite as simple as that. You still have to make sure that your case is going to be compatible with the motherboard. You want to make sure it fits in there.
You're right. There are some compatibility things you have to worry about, and also there are cases of different sizes, a mid-tower one, but, we'll go into the details of how that works later. And the great thing about this site, and I'll talk a little about this site after we're done with this segment, before we get into CPUs if we have time, is that it will automatically filter out parts that are not compatible with what you've chosen already. So you don't have,
very helpful.
Yeah, it's actually like one of the most super helpful things, and it actually helped me in several cases where I could not figure out why. I would not have realized that two parts were incompatible, but it flagged it, and so I was able to look and say, oh, okay, I didn't even realize that those two things were not compatible. So it's really, really valuable. And I wanted to mention we're not being paid or anything by this site. This is just this is a site that I personally have used for years, and I really love it. There are a bunch of other sites that do similar things. I really like the interface. I really like this site. Yeah, I think it's super helpful. So that's why we're using it. So going on, power supply. That is pretty self-explanatory. You just choose a power supply that provides enough power for your system. Operating system, that's your version of Windows you're going to use. You could also use Linux. We're not going to use Linux. I'm sorry. You can yell at us in the comments. We're not using Linux. We're using Windows. And then the last thing listed here is the case fan. And again, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's the case fan. The only thing you have to be careful there is to make sure you get two of them. I assume this is a pair of two. I didn't actually even check, but you need one to suck air in and one to push air out. You need one on front, one on the back of your case. Make sure you get two of those fans. Make sure you put the one that sucks air in on the front and the one that blows air out on the back, or vice versa, but just make sure you're not blowing them towards each other.
Right, yeah. Or away from each other.
Right. There needs to be a flow of air. One needs to suck in, one needs to blow out. That's I said I'd bring up any common errors I know people make. That is one of the more common errors I've heard people make is putting the fans in backwards. They'll fit both ways. Make sure one's sucking in, one's blowing out. That's all you got to do. But it is absolutely essential. If you do not do that, they will not get cool air in. If you don't get cool air in, your parts are going to overheat. They're going to melt. Your computer's going to be ruined. So, of all the things we've talked about here, one of the most important and one of the easiest to mess up, make sure those fans are going the right way.
So, Seth, this has been a low-end build, right?
Yeah.
This is basically everything you need in order to turn a computer on and show something on the monitor.
Correct.
apart from like the video card, we could leave that off, but we're
Correct.
talking about building something that's capable of playing games, right?
Yes.
So you want to have that. All right, but there are still more things we can add to this.
Correct, absolutely.
Like you mentioned before, there's optical drives.
Right, yeah.
Let's
bring up the high-end version that has a little bit more. So, for example, in this high-end version, I included a specific fan for the CPU itself because I have a much faster quad-core CPU. I included some thermal paste that you will use to attach that CPU cooler to the CPU. What else did I put in here? I believe that's the only
fan
extra component.
Controller.
Yeah, I included a fan controller that will monitor the speed of the fan and alter it so that you're using less power when the parts are not being pushed to their maximum.
I see also in the storage there is a solid state drive.
Yes, correct. We'll talk about the different types of storage that you can choose between. But yeah, we have a PCIe solid state drive, which is something I'm going to go into a lot of detail about these because they're when I was talking about ways to stop stuttering, this is one of the big ways.
Yeah, because theoretically, well, not to go into too much detail about it now, but you know, these are parts now that you add these parts in, and they make your gaming experience that much better.
Correct. And this
or your video editing experience,
right,
or whatever
correct.
you're doing.
So this hard drive here is similar to what we have in the low-end build. It's slightly slower because it's not being used as the hard drive used to run games or the operating system. It's the hard drive that I'll be storing additional stuff on. And when I need that, I will move, like, any game I'm currently playing, I would store on this hard drive here. Something that I want to keep for posterity's sake, for whatever reason, I would store on here. If I needed to access it, and it was a game or a super high definition movie, I'd move it here. So you have to do a bit of moving between the two drives when you have multiple hard drives like this, but the advantage is that you drastically reduce load times and stuttering. And we'll talk in detail about that stuff later. So we'll be back. I don't know how often we're going to be able to, we'll try to record this as often as possible. We both got busy schedules.
Yeah.
So we'll see when we can record the next episode. But hopefully within the next week or two, we'll be able to record another episode. And then I think what we're going to do is CPU through motherboard will be the next episode. Then we'll do our memory and storage as an episode. Then I'm probably going to dedicate an entire episode to the video card.
Yeah, I think so.
And then we'll end with your cases and the various things you have to put in the case to make it work.
Right.
Which are these things.
Right. Yeah, so, there's comments. If you have any questions, you can leave any questions. Or, if there's something that you want us to touch on in the future in more detail, please let us know.
That's something I was going to bring up. Thank you for mentioning that. Comments either on this video, we'll have this posted on YouTube. You can leave questions on our Facebook page. Do we have a Twitter these days?
We do have a Twitter. It's @luduspress.
Okay, yeah. So you can tweet to us. Just try to get us any questions you have in advance so that we can answer them. Like I said, the next episode we're going to be focusing on CPU and motherboard. So if you could specifically leave us questions about those components or about what we talked about today, then we'll be able to answer them next time. If you ask us questions about the remaining stuff, we'll of course answer them when we get to it. But for next time, if any questions you have about any of this stuff, please let us know. And again, I wanted to stress that I'm not going to have a video telling you which of the 20 different components you listed is the best one. That's not the point of this. The point is that you will be able to tell for yourself when we're done. So,
we're not reviewing the components here. We're not saying...
So if your question is, which of these should I buy, I'm not going to answer that. So even though I probably could, the answer is I'm not going to answer that. But anything about how these work, how to decide which ones to buy, I'll be happy to answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Seth. This has been a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to doing this and hopefully putting together, a decent machine here.
Yeah, I think it will be very interesting, especially because I'm definitely not going to be building a $2,250 computer, but I'm hopefully going to be building something, more around the lines of a $1,500 computer, and you're going to be building something, probably $600-700. So I think at the end it will be interesting to see what an extra, $1,000 or so gets you.
Right. Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think that'll do it then.
Yeah, awesome. Okay.
Thanks for watching, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you, Calvin, for letting me teach you.
Well, thank you for teaching me. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll talk to you all in a couple weeks, hopefully.
Maybe next week. We'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see what happens.
if we can make it work, then next week, yeah, awesome. Okay.
Awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Hello there, viewers. This is Calvin checking in at the very end to remind you to like this video and subscribe to Ludus Press, because you're going to want to stick around to the end of this series where we actually are going to do videos about putting these machines together and testing them out and making sure that they can run games. So you're definitely going to want to stick around for that. Also, please leave any questions that you have in the comments, and you can also email us at luduspress@gmail.com. And you can find us on various social media platforms at Ludus Press on Twitter, and just search for Ludus Press on Facebook. If you don't know how to spell Ludus Press, it's on the screen right in front of you in giant letters. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.